well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to this special event to celebrate and become acquainted with a remarkable book that's just been published, the second volume of Francis Fukuyama's extraordinary magnum opus on political order. I'll have a lot more to say about that in a moment. I want to begin by thanking Frank for making the Freeman Spogli Institute and Stanford University the site of the first US event to mark the release of Political Order and Political Decay, Volume 2 of his great work on political order. Frank is coming directly from London and the Netherlands, where he launched the European version of this book. But today, here, right now, with you sitting here, marks the launch in the United States of Political Order and Political Decay. I think most of you know that Francis Fukuyama has been with us now for more than 4 years as the Olivier Nomellini Senior Fellow here at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, where he's a core member of the faculty of our Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. And I think I've met most of you. I'm Larry Diamond. I'm the director of CDDRL. Frank came to Stanford, I think most of you know, from an extended and extremely impactful decade teaching at the NITSA School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins in Washington, D.C., where I must confess I believe did the writing for volume 1 of this book project, but it was released here and celebrated here not long after he arrived. And I think most of you know that these 2 volumes mark an interesting evolution, which we're going to explore, of his academic and scholarly career, which has been absolutely prolific and began in a way we're coming full circle now with the kind of global impact in thinking about political development that these 2 volumes are having with the release of The End of History and The Last Man in 1992. And if you look at the trajectory, which I'm hoping we can get into, Frank, of your work, you can kind of see a lot of the elements that have been brought together in these 2 volumes, taking shape first in The End of History, in his remarkable book in 1996, Trust, the Social Virtues and the Creation of Prosperity. Obviously, the concern with state building was marked in a very significant and impactful way, not only for the intellectual world, but the policy world, in his 2004 book, State Building, Governance and World Order in the 21st Century. And some of you may be familiar with his book, America at the Crossroads, Democracy, Power, and the Neoconservative Legacy. You might have read the United States figures very prominently in this new volume. And his book on Latin America, Falling Behind, explaining the development gap between Latin America and the US. Anyway, Frank, welcome back to the US and to the launch of your American book tour. I guess you kicked it off in a way on Michael Krasny about an hour ago up in San Francisco on KQED. And if people have not gotten enough of you here, I presume they can go to the website of Michael Krasny's forum show and catch your interview as well. So I want to begin in kind of an odd and eccentric way, but as your colleague the last 4 years in your lectures to our students in the Summer Fellows Program and so on, it's become apparent for a while now that you are just seized in a way that we didn't think could generate this kind of energy and, in a way, almost sexiness with the topic of public administration. So you seem to be, you're the modern version of Max Weber and, in a way, Woodrow Wilson. We used to think of this as a very dry subject. So why are you so passionate about public administration?
Well, thank you very much, Larry. So before I answer that question, since you said all those nice things about me, I'm going to say some nice things about you and CDDRL. So this actually is the beginning of my 5th year here. I was recruited by you and Mike McFall and Catherine and Chip and a number of other people to come to FSI, and it's just been a really, really great home. And actually, I really don't think I could have done this book without the support of CDDRL, and then all the research assistants, several of whom I see around the room, but colleagues and students here. So it's really great, that you're all here for this, and I really do appreciate it. And you, Larry, have been especially supportive in all of this as we've struggled with these issues over the last few years. Okay, so the question of public administration, if you utter the words public administration in any kind of a room, most of the audience then immediately falls asleep. And this is the reason why the World Bank never uses the term public administration. They use this much sexier word governance, and so they say good governance is really important. But actually what they mean is you need a government that can actually deliver things. And there's several examples of how that's incredibly important for development. So in the late 1990s, the activist and economist Jean Drèze did the study of education in several poor states in northern India, and he discovered that 50% of the school teachers did not show up for work. This caused a big hue and cry in Indian politics and a lot of criticism and so forth. And after 10 years of attempted reform, they did another survey, and it turned out 50% of school teachers were not showing up for work. And that's a purely administrative problem. Like, there's no argument over the ends of public policy. Everybody thinks you ought to teach elementary school kids, and the teachers ought to show up if they're being paid, and yet they could not fix this kind of problem. And obviously, very low levels of education are a really big problem in India. There's a authority in Nigeria, your favorite country, called the Nigerian Electric Power Authority, state-run utility. Nigerians say NEPA actually stands for no electric power anytime, because roughly, the electricity is extremely spotty. And again, this is a publicly owned utility, and they cannot get it to produce electricity reliably, which is important for the economy, and so on and so forth. And then, even closer to home, the Greek blow-up in the euro crisis, in part was driven by, there's a lot of complex causes to this, including the design of the euro itself, but one of the causes was Greek failure to control their public spending. And the reason for that is that Greece never developed a modern state. We all celebrated the fact that the colonel stepped down in 1974, and there's been an alternation of political parties, but what the two parties, PASOK and New Democracy, have done ever since then is basically to load up the public sector with their own political clients with every change in turnover in parties. And as a result, Greece has something like 7 times the per capita number of civil servants that Britain does. And that's one of the reasons they can't control their wage bills. So there's, and I think that at this point in development economics, everybody accepts the fact that institutions are important, that if you don't have the right kinds of political institutions to support property rights, just basic citizen security, deliver basic public goods, health, education, this sort of thing, the other economic aspects of development aren't going to happen. But Americans really have a hard time, especially Americans have a hard time focusing on this question, because so in my conceptual framework, a modern political system has 3 basic sets of institutions. So it has the state itself, which is the Weberian legitimate monopoly of force or power over territory. And then you've got the rule of law, which is the constraint. Basically it's an instrument of constraint on that power by clear and transparent rules, ideally. And then finally you've got democratic accountability, which seeks to ensure that that power is used for public purposes, reflecting the wishes of the whole population, not just the elite running the government. And we Americans, in our political tradition, have really focused on the instruments of constraint. So the common law was a foundation of American governance from before the revolution. Obviously, democracy has been key to the way we think about ourselves. So we think about constraining government power all the time. But as Samuel Huntington once said, before you can constrain power, you have to generate power. And we don't like to think about the generation of power. And therefore, you talk to an American about how you need actually better public administration, you need a stronger, more coherent executive and the authority to actually do things. And Americans just stop listening. They say, we just want smaller government, or we want to get rid of government. And so I think that even for us as the oldest and most developed democracy, this is still a big problem, which is an issue I obviously get into in some detail in the course of the book.
So I want to come back in a few minutes to the interaction among these three elements. But first, since you mentioned Sam Huntington, let's talk about the origins of not Political Order, the phenomenon, but Political Order, the two-volume work. You were a student of Huntington's, you were an admirer of Huntington's, as many of us were. And I remember many years ago when you said, well, it's time to kind of rewrite and update Political Order in Changing Societies, that seminal work. And I guess that was the origins of this book. But I imagine it grew well beyond what you envisioned. So how does this book differ from Huntington's great 1968 book? What was updated? What do you think he got wrong?
So Sam Huntington, before he passed away in 2006, actually asked me, Yale University Press was going to republish the book. It had been out of print for a number of years, and so they were going to put it back in print. And he was kind enough to ask me to write a new preface for it, which I did. And that's really what got me thinking, that he got some really important things right, but he also got a bunch of things wrong, and that the book was so important that it really needed, somebody needed to lay this out systematically. So that's how we ended up with these two volumes. So the part that he got right, I think, is really fundamental, and that's where there's a big continuity between his book and my book. You can summarize the bottom line of his 1968 book very simply in the phrase, all good things do not go together. So the background of this was the modernization theory that was dominant in the 1950s and 60s, where the theory basically was all good things do go together. So economic growth, democratization, increasing individualism, development of social relations, all of these things were mutually supportive. They were part of a seamless modernization process. And Huntington said, well, look around the world today. So this was a very turbulent period with a lot of coups and civil wars and so forth. And he said, in fact, all good things do not go together. And if you have especially social mobilization, that is to say the economic growth driving the formation of new social groups that demand political participation, and if your political institutions do not keep up with that demand for participation, you're going to have what he called political decay and the collapse and the kind of instability that was evident then. And that is still fundamental, I think, to my perspective in these two volumes, that all good things do not go together. But I carry that argument beyond, I think, what Sam argued. So he said the social mobilization and the political development aspects don't always go together, and sometimes you got to choose order or the mobilization, and hence get to this thing that he called the authoritarian transition. You sequence the way in which you introduce these institutions. But I would say the situation is actually worse, because within the three components of what I call a modern political order, you also have certain tensions where all good things don't go together. And in particular, democracy and good governance oftentimes are at odds, because the principle, I think, of good public administration is expertise, meritocracy, technical knowledge, this sort of thing. And the essence of democracy is participation. And these are fundamentally, I wouldn't say fundamentally, but they're very often contradictory goals. And you see this in the United States, where Andrew Jackson is elected president in 1828, the first American populist, based on the expansion of the franchise to all white males that occurred in the United States in this period. He was the beneficiary of it. He gets into office, he says two things. I won the election, therefore I should appoint who gets an office in the US government. And secondly, essentially any idiot can do this. You don't have to have a Harvard or Yale education to run the US government. And so this is the beginning of the American patronage system. And I've got a chapter entitled The US Invents Clientelism, because I think the United States was the first country to create a patronage, clientelistic system in which for 100 years, virtually every single office in the United States was allocated because you were the supporter of some, congressman or senator or governor or mayor or whatever. It led to a very poor quality, a lot of corruption, and very poor quality of administration. And so that tension, I think, continues to exist in Europe, in the United States. I mean, in Europe, you have kind of technocrats running the EU, and then a lot of people who feel that they don't really reflect their interests, and I think that's one of the key weaknesses in the legitimacy of that whole European project. So that's the sense in which I think all good things do not go together, and that's the sense in which I think I actually am carrying on Huntington's tradition. Now, the things that he got wrong are a lot. So the first page, this famous phrase, Soviet Union and the United States are equally developed, and he basically, for some reason, thought that China and the Soviet Union had participatory systems because they had mass political parties, and he was wrong about that. I mean, as I think the collapse of communism subsequently demonstrated. And then he also argued that the greatest degree of instability occurred in modernizing societies rather than purely traditional or fully modernized ones. And that also has not been borne out statistically. I mean, the stuff that Jim Furon and David Layton do about analyzing the sources of conflict indicate pretty clearly that the really bad conflict comes in extremely poor, underdeveloped countries and not in ones that are actually making a transition. So, I think those parts you would not accept anymore, but I think the fundamental insight about all good things not going together is still there.
So the implication seems to be that if you can develop a rule of law and an effective state, which is not the same thing as a large state, earlier on, democracy is going to develop in a more sustainable and deeper way. But a lot of the problem that people, analysts and ordinary people have been pointing to in sub-Saharan Africa, among many of the weakest and poorest states of the world, is that if you don't have the check of democratic accountability,
right,
you've got your favorite word now, patrimonialism, run wild. And so it seems to be a kind of trap where maybe democracy isn't sustainable because the state is weak, the rule of law is very partial at best, and if you don't get democracy in place, will these very poor, weak states be able to get the other elements? So are the Liberias of the world just condemned to this kind of constant vicious cycle of weakness on all three fronts?
Well, that trap has always existed. You can't have economic growth without institutions, but you can't have institutions without economic growth. So how did anyone ever develop, And I think the answer to that is a lot of it actually was kind of breaking out of the trap was accidental in a lot of cases, including early developers like Britain, who for some reason, developed legal institutions early on without intending this to be the basis of economic growth or anything else, because the church supported the common law and this sort of thing. And I think similarly, the way you get out of, so first of all, to back up a little bit, it's easier to get out of the trap these days because unlike the first countries that developed, we have a lot of accumulated social knowledge about what good institutions look like. And so although you cannot take a template and say Denmark looks like this, so therefore you, Sierra Leone, are going to look like Denmark. I mean, that obviously doesn't work, but at least, there's some knowledge of the stages of development and the experiences of other countries and how they've built institutions. And if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, the quality of finance ministries and central banks over the last 30 years, from the debt crisis in the 1980s to the present, there's no comparison. All these countries have done a lot of state building, and their state capacity is enormously better than it was. But there still are trap-like elements because, in a lot of cases, you get improvement in some areas, but because you haven't solved the underlying, problem of social cohesion, or there's no national identity, that threatens to unravel the whole thing. And so that's the threat that exists in a place like Kenya, where, they've had reasonable economic growth, they've had a reasonable democracy, but they've got this unsolved social tension among the country's ethnic groups that could set them, back tremendously.
So let's for a moment locate your work in the evolution of the literature on political and economic development in a different sense. This isn't the only kind of really ambitious effort to comprehend development that's been published in the last decade. We have North, Wallace, and Weingast, Violence and Social Orders. A bit more recently, Acemoglu and Robinson, Why Nations Fail. So how does your work differ or in some ways align with the big arguments in those two volumes?
So I have profited a lot from those two books especially because, as you say, they've got a similar scope and ambition. And I think both of them are very useful. The Violence and Social Orders book, establishes these categories of open access orders and limited access orders, which you can translate into my language as saying, rule of law, impartial state, democratic contestation is an open access order versus some form of authoritarian crony capitalism, so forth. And I think both of those books are particularly good at describing the interdependence of the political order and the economic order. In particular, the North Wallace-Weingast concept is that you maintain stability and you fix the problem of violence essentially by dividing rents among the elite, and that keeps them, in check, and that's actually a very important stabilizing mechanism, and that this is the way that countries have stabilized themselves really up until the first open access order emerged within the last 100 years, and even to this day, there's not more than a couple dozen societies in the world that have achieved this, this status. So that, I think, is an important contribution. But it seems to me that both of those books are missing a couple of things. And one is actually a theory of how you develop. The taxonomy of the different categories of development are there, but there's no dynamic theory that explains how you get from one of these orders to another order. And the reason I think that those categories are missing, it kind of has to do with the rational choice framework in which both of them are set, where the order is determined by these rational calculations of elites, but what's missing from that is actually society. There's no category of social mobilization. And that was critical to Huntington's book. I mean, he said the reason you get political decay is because the rate of social mobilization exceeds the rate of political institutionalization. But there's no category of social mobilization. And I think that, in fact, that was the fundamental 19th century insight of European social theory that goes back to to Karl Marx. He said, look, you get a different mode of production, the bourgeoisie. First of all, you create this thing called the bourgeoisie that create modern capitalism. They create the proletariat. You get classes. The classes clash, and that's really what produces historical progress. But if you don't have this category of social mobilization, all you have are the elites, and you have really no explanation of how the elites get from one place to another. And the other, I think, missing part has to do with ideas. And ideas are actually very closely related to social mobilization. The way you mobilize people in the world is by giving them an idea to unite around, e.g. nationalism or religion. So what's going on in the Middle East right now? You've got this huge amount of social mobilization that's destabilizing all of those countries. And this particular form of it has to do with, radical Islam and kind of reinterpreting, instead of the local Sufi saints and everything, you've got this very universalistic kind of Islam that's burst onto the scene in the past generation. And that's enough to get people out of their beds, from wherever they're living in London or Brixton or, Minneapolis on an airplane to Somalia or to Syria, to join up with these jihadist groups. And they're mobilized socially because the ideas give them an identity and a reason for, taking risks and so forth. And so I think that's where the fundamentally economic models really miss something important, because without these motivating ideas, you don't get social mobilization, and then it's the social mobilization. The social mobilization also comes from just economic growth as well, but even so, it has to be interpreted through people that explain to people, as Karl Marx did, what's going on in the world? Why am I an alienated worker in a factory in Sheffield? And how do I get out of my situation? I mean, that's really the domain of ideology. So I would say that's really it. And part of my purpose in these two volumes is actually to recapture that, that element of social mobilization as a kind of the dominant driver of development.
Okay, so we have the three elements of state, rule of law, democratic accountability, or the aspiration for it. We've got this element of economic development and the consequence of social mobilization that is bearing down on those first three elements. We've got ideas maybe accumulating into ideology. And all of this is churning historically. But there's another big story that runs through your book, which is basically about politics. You talk about political shocks, you talk about political leadership, you talk about political coalitions that emerge out of the social mobilization and are kind of shaped and forged and inspired by political leaders. So tell us a good story about how those interact to drive positive change toward democratic accountability and political development rather than political decay.
Well, so this is an important story, I think, from the standpoint of a lot of contemporary developing countries who are mired in corruption and highly clientelistic political systems. All the Indias, Nigerias, Brazils, Mexicos, and so forth. And the story I think that's the most relevant to their situation is the one that I tell in the book about the progressive era in the United States. So the background of this, as I said, was this highly corrupt patronage-based system that 19th century America developed. And how did the United States develop a modern Weberian administrative state in the face of this? And politically, this is a huge problem, because if you think about the situation in the late 19th century, every member of Congress, every president, every governor, certainly every mayor of the Bostons and Chicagos and New Yorks had a very large stake in keeping the patronage system going, because that's how they got elected, right? And you get, first of all, the development of reform ideas by people like Woodrow Wilson, who started out as a political science professor at Johns Hopkins and wrote about why the United States really needs a kind of modern German, French, British type of state. But nobody listens to professors, as we well know.
Unless they become governors and then presidents.
Yeah, that's right. So nobody listens to professors. You need a political strategy to overcome what's essentially a political problem, that you've got all these stakeholders that want to keep the system the way it is. And what happened in this period was, first of all, there's a big grassroots mobilization. So you had a lot of economic modernization going on. So this is the decades after the Civil War, the 70s and 80s of the 19th century, where you had a lot of new social groups emerging for the first time. So you had a class of professionals in every city. You had lawyers, doctors, university professors. The United States created this land-grant college system to basically train agronomists. So for the first time, you had people that could apply modern natural science to agricultural productivity. You had urban reformers, people like Jane Addams, who organized the poor and set out a very different kind of social agenda. And one of the things that's hard to contemplate, from this remove, but back in the 1880s, people actually did care about public administration and civil service reform, because every fourth-class postmaster in the United States would turn over every 2 years because a different party was elected. The Republicans would replace the Democrats or vice versa, and everybody would be fired, and there would be a completely new set of equally, incompetent officials replacing them. And a lot of businessmen said, this system is no good. We need a modern, stable public administration, and there's a tremendous amount of moralism. I think also, this is a kind of unfortunate little dirty secret about a lot of good government, that there's a moral element to this as well. If you look at the countries that first developed modern Weberian bureaucracies, a lot of them were strongly influenced by Calvinism. So the great elector in Prussia was a Calvinist in a Lutheran society, and he actually brought a lot of Dutch Huguenot and Dutch Calvinists to be his bureaucrats, because he didn't trust the local, elites in Prussia. The Dutch Republic obviously had a lot of these Calvinists, and the nonconformist churches in England were on the parliamentary side in the English Civil War, played a very big role in reforming the English government. And this kind of evangelical Calvinist moralism was very important in the progressive era, because there was a class of American elite official who has just gone from the world, in the 21st century, who were WASPs. They were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who were very morally upright and very, very concerned about the kind of municipal corruption that they saw in these big city machines, with all the, Irish, Italian, Jewish, voters being mobilized by these machines, and they wanted to clean up the government. And so with the right kind of leadership from people like Teddy Roosevelt, they created a coalition. It took an external shock, which was the assassination of James A. Garfield. So Garfield was elected president in 1882. He was shot by a guy named Guiteau, who wanted to be the ambassador to France. He spent 6 weeks dying. People think that his doctors actually made him worse and killed him, but that was the state of medicine back in the 1880s. And when he died, people were so embarrassed by the fact that an office seeker in the patronage system had killed the President of the United States, that they voted for something called the Pendleton Act, which was the first major effort to reform the civil service. It created the Civil Service Commission. Civil service exams were implemented for the first time, and so forth. And so this is how you get out of it. And the thing is, it's not a magic bullet, because this was like a 40-year struggle, political struggle, that then ensued to create a more effective American state from the 1880s really up until the 1920s. You do it politically. You mobilize, you lead people, you organize, you give them the right ideas, and that's how you get rid of a corrupt, patronage-based system. And anyone can do it. The Brazilians can do it, the Turks or the Mexicans, and you see evidence of this. I mean, you look at the protesters in Brazil. What are they mad about? They're mad about bus service, about wasting money on corrupt politicians. World Cup and the Olympics and basic services are not there. Most of them are middle class, and that's the group, that's the social group that's going to fix Brazil if it eventually gets fixed.
Okay, I'm going to fast forward to the United States today, which is a very important and passionate element in this book. I think it will surprise people, perhaps, to discover how prominently the United States figures in your thinking and even your theoretical arguments about political development and political decay. And this is not a terribly uplifting discussion. Your last statement was very uplifting, Frank, but your discussion of American democracy today, which we've been hearing in our American democracy program, so it's not completely new to us, but I think it will be somewhat new to a lot of readers in terms of your analysis, is deeply sobering. I do want to say, if you don't have the time immediately this weekend to read all 550 pages of this book, you can get the essence of Frank's thinking about the recent evolution of American democracy in a really powerful article distilled from the book which is the cover article in this issue of Foreign Affairs, which you can download for free through the Stanford system. So I want to read you the last paragraph of your Foreign Affairs article. The depressing, and for everyone else, the depressing, your word, bottom line, is that given how self-reinforcing this country's political malaise is, and how unlikely the prospects for constructive incremental reform are, the decay of American politics and the problem of vetocracy, which you used to summarize it, will probably continue until some external shock comes along to catalyze a true reform coalition and galvanize it into action. So what's happened to our system of government, our democracy, that have created such a state of political decay, malaise, deadlock, vetocracy, and why are you so pessimistic about the near-term prospects for fundamental reform?
I think that, and this is something we've been talking a lot about in our American politics project here at CDDRL. So I think the problem in the United States is both a social one and an institutional one. So the institutional side I've talked about already. The United States founding fathers created a constitution that had many, many checks and balances in it because their primary goal was to prevent the emergence of tyranny. They just fought this revolution against George III. They did not trust or like concentrated political power. And so one of the deepest elements of American political culture has been distrust of centralized government. And therefore, we divide power in many, many ways. So we have a separately elected presidency. We have a very powerful upper house of the legislature. We have a court system that can veto legislation passed by Congress. We devolve power to state and local governments. So at many levels, and as Huntington said in his original book, we actually don't divide power, we just replicate power. And so there's, you think about, getting a permit for building an on-ramp to the Oakland Bay Bridge. You got to get permissions from the EPA at the national level, from the state environmental authority, and then from the city of Oakland, and then the Coastal Commission, and So we divide power in very many ways. For much of the 20th century, at least, this system could be made to work because the two political parties overlapped very substantially. And there was actually a fairly strong ideological consensus. The people had accepted the welfare state and the New Deal in the Republican Party, and there's still a lot of conservative Democrats and so forth. But what has happened since then is, first of all, those two parties have completely split apart so that the most liberal Republican is now considerably more conservative than the most conservative Democrat. And we've actually multiplied the number of institutional vetoes in a system that already had a lot of vetoes. And the result is, and then it furthermore interacts with the courts and with the growth of interest groups, which have become much more well-funded and well-organized. The figures on lobbying in Washington over the last 20 years is just staggering. The growth of the number and the resources that these groups bring to bear. So when you bring all of this together against the institutional framework of the United States, you get a situation in which very well-organized groups can veto things that are detrimental to their interest, and it makes it very difficult to make collective decisions for things that are regarded to be in the public interest. So most obvious example of this is the budget. So we had a nice workshop on budgeting in the United States, and most people in other developed countries cannot believe our process. We have not Congress has not passed a budget since 2008 by its own rules. So we lurch along from continuing resolution to continuing resolution. We shut down the government completely under the current rules. When the government was shut down last fall, it was actually a criminal offense to show up for work if you were a federal government employee during that period. The tax code is a complete travesty. As I think a lot of people are aware, we have the highest marginal tax rate for corporate taxes of any OECD, just about any OECD country, but most corporations simply negotiate breaks or subsidies or tax exemptions for themselves, so very few companies actually pay that rate. And this is the example of vetocracy. So everybody in Washington says, yes, we should lower the marginal tax rate and then get rid of all these special, special privileges, but you can't do it. You can't do it because the collective interest in having a more rational taxation system is too easy to veto by well-organized interest groups. Or just something, I mean, this is something that caught Mike McFall up. We got something like 60 ambassadorships that are stuck in the Senate. And
waiting for confirmation.
Waiting for confirmation, because every senator can put a hold on any given executive branch appointment without giving a reason for it. And so can you imagine running Google or IBM if every member of the board could veto every single mid-level managerial appointment that the CEO makes? I mean, it's a completely crazy system. So anyhow, this is the basic argument, that we're in this, and given, and it's sort of like the period before the Pendleton Act, the incumbents have really strong interest in keeping the system this way. And the question is, how do you generate a coalition that's actually going to fix this system? And my problem with America right now is I don't see even the beginnings of that coalition anywhere in either party. I don't really see how you're going to do it. And by the way, the Republicans, have a good point that we need to do entitlement reform, not today, but we're going to need to do this down the road. Traditionally, vetocracy has been something preferred by conservatives because they want to avoid the growth of big government, and it actually worked. It really slowed down the growth of American government compared to Europe. But it also means that if you want to reform that government and do entitlement reform, it operates as it prevents the government from getting smaller as well. It's going to be really hard to do entitlement reform because, again, people that want to keep their mortgage interest deduction are so well organized that Congress dare not, touch it.
Yeah, this is the problem that Mansur Olson wrote about,
Yeah.
of defined interest groups that you articulate, citing Olson in the book. Okay, let's go back nearly a quarter of a century to another book, your first big book, The End of History. Now, and The Last Man. That has been, as you know, I know it's like fingers screeching on the blackboard, just wildly distorted and misinterpreted. And it's often depicted as some orgiastic effusion of Hegelian euphoria about, the final triumph of the advanced form of political civilization, and that isn't what you meant. But I mean, there is a very optimistic thread to that book, or thrust to that book, and that optimism isn't thrusting forward at the end of this book in the same way. I mean, the second half of this book is about political decay, and a lot of what you write in this book reminds me of a term that Philippe Schmitter used about 20 years ago to speculate on what might be the trajectory of a lot of these new democracies after the end of the Cold War, that they would wind up being condemned to democracy, that it's the only legitimate form of government, but Italy and Greece, as you talk about in the book, some of these other developing country democracies, they're just not functioning well. Sherry Berman, in her review of your book in the New York Times, as you know, speculated that maybe if liberal democracies can't turn the corner on the problems you've just articulated, that history may not end with a bang, but with a whimper. So how do you reflect back on the end of history and on this kind of global trend and challenge?
Well, I think two things have happened since I published that book. By the way, it wasn't that optimistic because the title was The End of History and the Last Man, and the last man part was all about why life in a modern liberal democracy may not actually be that satisfying. But be that as it may, so I think I've changed and the world has changed. And so there's things I just hadn't thought about adequately. So the role of the state, and I think the importance of institutionalization and just how difficult it is to actually create institutions. The idea is there. Everybody in Hong Kong right now, or in Ukraine, or in this Tahrir Square had this idea about democracy, but actually translating that into political parties that could contest elections and bureaucracies and independent courts and all of these things that you need to actually make a functioning liberal democracy, I hadn't, I mean, and I guess it's partly my spending a lot of time thinking about this in developing countries where these institutions are often non-existent that made me realize that this getting to Denmark problem was very serious. And then the whole category of political decay was not part of my mental universe back in the late 1980s. And that, I think, is something I've observed not just in democracies. I think any regime is subject to decay. I think the current Chinese regime shows certain signs of decay. And one of the big contests between these different models is which of our societies is actually going to be able to reverse their decay in time before it becomes, destabilizing and threatening the fundamental legitimacy. So that's my thinking. But then the world has changed also. I would say before we get too carried away with how awful the world is right now, and all of this I learned from you, because you're the one that keeps tabs on the progress of global democracy. It is still worth remembering that we've gone from about 35, 40 electoral democracies in 1970 to 110, 115, something like that in 2014. And although we've been experiencing, this reverse wave over the last 8 years, we're still much, much more democratic on the whole now than we were 2 generations ago. And so that's actually a big achievement. But I do really worry, and I've been really worried in 2014, because a number of things have been happening that may suggest that this is actually just, so we've had this slight reverse wave, but this may turn into something much more serious, because really for the first time you've got 2 really big countries, Russia and China, that are very self-confident, and they've made territorial claims, and they're kind of on the move in a way that they weren't 10 years ago. And that's a big development. And then this continuing, lack of stateness in the Middle East and the inability to create fundamental institutions in a part of the world that's extremely important is also very, I think threatening to a lot of us. And so the world is just, not cooperating. So that's why I think you get a much more pessimistic tone in the current book than you did in the earlier one.
Okay, that's a perfect segue to my last question, and then we're going to open it up to your questions. So we have still a fair amount of resilience to democratic expansion and expectations in the world, but state building and institution building, wow, really hard. So what does this mean for democracy promotion policies and practices? What have you learned or thought about that?
I think it has a lot of implications. So the one implication that Huntington drew that I actually don't agree with is the need for sequencing. He is the inventor of this authoritarian transition. So he said, look, you can't do everything at once, so get the state in place first. It can be authoritarian, excuse me, you can then grow, and then you can have democracy later. This has worked in South Korea, in Taiwan, in a number of other countries, but as I think we in CDDRL have discussed on many occasions, first of all, sequencing, there's no Olympian position from which you can say, okay, we're going to have rule of law now, and then we'll have democracy in another 20 years when there's 100,000 people in your capital city demonstrating that they want democracy. I mean, just nobody can make that kind of a decision. And I think for better or worse, we actually have to work on all of these different institutions simultaneously. So the Fried Zakaria, let's have rule of law for, first of all, nobody, so Eric, where's Eric? Yeah, so nobody knows how to, except for Eric, nobody knows how to create a rule of law in any event. So thinking about sequencing it, isn't going to be that easy. However, I do think that, and this is what I've been arguing as a board member at the National Endowment for Democracy for some time now, we need to think well beyond the initial transition. A lot of our energy has gone into that initial mobilization that brings about Maidan or Tahrir Square, gets the bad old dictator out of there. But there are 2 immediate steps that then need to follow in order to consolidate. So the first is actually organizing political parties. This is something that Democrats and liberals everywhere in the world are really, really bad at. You know, the Russians couldn't do this, the Ukrainians couldn't do this, the Egyptians couldn't do this. I mean, what this means is you want a democracy, but you got to contest an election, which means you got to set up organizations in every single rural district to get people out to vote. And this just doesn't come easily to, in fact, Huntington said this in his 1968 book, you know, students can't organize their way out of a bag, and they don't know how to set up parties like this. Muslim Brotherhood, who's been organizing people for several generations, they're really good at that. You know, they may not be more popular, but they're really good at organization. So you got to get the organization. And this is the point where the Ukrainians are right now, once you get the organization, you have to be able to govern. You know, you actually have to be able to formulate public policies and implement them, which means that you need people that are willing to move from civil society into the government to make it better and to actually get rid of corruption, you know, deliver education and services and security and all that stuff. And again, we have not given nearly as much thought to that aspect, which is why we end up at the beginning point, your first question about public administration, you know. So all these heroic people that have been standing against tyranny now have to go back to school and learn, you know, how do you take the garbage out in a complex society, because if you don't take the garbage out, or, you know, I mean, look at this terrible stuff that's going on with Ebola in Liberia and Sierra Leone. I mean, this is pure matter of public administration. You know, they've got 100 doctors in Sierra Leone, and that whole system, you know, was never strong to begin with, and so somebody has to figure out how to organize this stuff. So I would say that's the lesson, is that the follow-on components are really, really important if you're actually going to get to a real democracy, and we need to put a lot of effort into thinking about how to do that.